All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the end of the world with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And today we are following up on our previous episode about the decline of the Roman Republic, this time focusing in on the rise and catastrophic fall of the legendary man, one of the great geniuses of all time. That's it. It's Julius Caesar. But before we get into all that, we've got a little bit of news to cover. And some of it involves errant group chat inclusion.
Yes, we've all been there.
Have we?
Stakes generally speaking lower. That is actually true. That's like one of the insane things about this story is like, I know that I've never just mistakenly added someone to a group chat. Where do you fall on that?
I've certainly never added anyone. I think I've been invited to group chats that ultimately seemed like they weren't really for me. Like a couple times on Twitter back in the day,
I've certainly been added on like WhatsApp to spam like.
Oh well, yeah, that happens too. That happens too. Yeah. I've been added to innumerable like.
We're all meeting at 4:30 p.m. to talk about how we're going to be so rich by 7:30. Join us, like that type of shit.
Yeah, exactly. But Michael, why don't you run down the like basics of what seems to have happened here?
Well, I'm not actually entirely sure who was responsible for the addition. Was it Waltz?
It seems like it was this guy, Michael Waltz, who added Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, to this national security signal chat.
Right. So that's the first thing that just like threw me. Like, I guess it makes sense. I guess it would happen, but like even just that sounded weirdly close to public consumption. Like, I just assumed that these groups and these people had completely separate, secure channels of communication. Do you know what I mean? Like, it felt weird just being like, they were on Signal and then oopsied. Like, I was like, what? You guys are just on what I'm on?
Yeah, it's the cat is scratching something in the background. It's very loud on my end. Apologies, but it's a kind of ringing endorsement for Signal, and my friend Meredith Whitaker is the president of Signal. So hopefully this
must be a fun day.
Yeah, but it's also funny because they hate Signal, right? I mean, their whole thing is like this: they've got to have a backdoor. Terrorists could be, and it's like you yourselves are using it. Like,
yeah, and so the slip up occurred. Not only did they add, it's Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor in chief of The Atlantic. They added him to the chat, which is
he added him as like a friend or whatever.
Right. But then what's unclear to me, I don't know if you have a better idea, but like how long he was in the chat.
Seems just a couple days.
So he just kind of stuck around for a minute, and then it turned to like very sensitive national security information about
the attack on the Houthis. Yeah, he got added to the like Houthi strategy group. And it was like all the cabinet people. It's like J.D. Vance and Hegseth and real just murderer's row of imbeciles.
I mean, literally, according to what they were talking about, they were exactly that. But it's a great example, right, of the combination, the danger that we're facing, which, I think you talk about a fair bit too, of just like the tendency for overarching conspiracy and these sophisticated mechanisms of power control. This is a good example of just what's wrong right now is the combination of people who want to do heinous things and also seem to be pretty stupid.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this a lot over the course of the pod, but my default position is like, rather than it being some elaborate conspiracy, most of the time it's just incompetence, right?
Yeah. Like, and this seems to be a pretty clear case of that. Although the thing that then, of course, gets picked up is like, who benefits? What was this? Is why are you adding him? What's the process to doing that? And like, could he, I guess, been trying to add him to a different chat? Maybe?
I have no idea. Like, or is this an op of some kind? Did they do this to like discredit him by being like, see, he leaks secrets or something?
Right. Well,
But
they
that
did.
seems incredibly stupid.
Yeah, it seems like there would be a million ways to do that. Again, if you were the sort of competent, malicious, malevolent type of person who many people believe are behind these greater
Right, it'd be like
conspiracies.
far better to leak fake info that they
Mhm.
then publish and be like, that's fake. You fell for
Yeah.
our trap or whatever.
Although some of their early defenses have been criticisms of him and the Atlantic,
Right.
which I love, which is like, they're kind of there have been some moments where people who are involved or adjacent to it or whatever are kind of implying they're just saying he's a bad journalist.
Doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. And then there's people, I've actually seen some people in the sort of journalist community who are criticizing Goldberg for voluntarily, like he saw what was going on and he left the chat.
Weird. Well,
Now, but like I sort of feel, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Goldberg or the Atlantic by any
no,
stretch.
really?
I feel like I would get off the chat probably.
Yeah, I just don't want to be. I don't need. I don't need
don't
that.
think,
I don't need that heat coming after me. Right.
right.
Like,
I think like once it gets harder to claim that you like didn't really know what was going on, like if he just sat around as long as he could and then was found out, I bet he probably could have gotten in some sort of like espionage
oh,
trouble.
I'm sure they will attempt to do that anyway. But
True.
the JD Vance being like, Pete Hegseth, if you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing out Europe again. Let's make sure our messaging is tight here. If there are things we can do up front to minimize risk to Saudi oil facilities, we should do
Mhm.
it. And
Yes.
then,
A humanist to the bitter end.
and then
This man-
Hegseth's like, VP, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic. And then
But
he goes,
who will think of the Saudi oil infrastructure at a time like this, Stu?
yeah. And then there's another thing people have been pointing out is that there appears to be some ambiguity about whether Trump has authorized this. And Stephen Miller chimes in to be like, as I heard it, the president was clear, green light. But we soon make clear to Egypt and Europe what we expect in return. And it's like, well, hold on. Isn't Trump's big thing about Biden that he's like this out of touch guy in La La Land who can, and then here we just see his minions being like, yeah, Trump is okay at this.
Yeah, no, we're good to go.
Like he nodded towards me as I mentioned it. I think that's green light.
Right.
We're good.
It's also funny to see like these, huge security. Let's use the term loosely. Huge aggressive decisions in a foreign policy manner being made in this way, and even when it's not Trump who talks this way a lot, but like his people discussing it transactionally, like how do we make sure we get our money back from Europe is like right at the top of the list of concerns before they launch.
Like, why are we running this country like it's a casino that needs to make sure?
That's right.
That,
like we've got the gold cards now, and they're like, we could do this attack, but we do want to ensure access to oil. Oh, and you know what? Let's try to make sure that Europe and Egypt are paying top dollar for this operation. Oh man,
it's quite bizarre, right?
And of course, with all these things, it's not actually funny, but it is just so absurd that like, again, it feels so basic, and I don't know what I imagined. You know what I mean?
Well, this is the thing about like the Kennedy documents that came out and stuff too. When you see the like what these evil masterminds of the world are like in their, they're all just a bunch of idiots. They're all just a bunch of people like us, like anyone else. It's not like there's some, you don't ascend to some higher level of linguistic mastery or whatever just by virtue of being in the CIA or whatever.
Exactly. Right. Well, I mean, the other thing we do want to touch on before we get into Julius Caesar's glorious rise and unglorious downfall. Among other news, Stu, you had an essay published today, correct?
That's correct, yeah. An essay...
So explain what it is, and then take a crack at explaining the essay to someone like me.
It's an essay called Cybernetics, the Evolution of Philosophy, and it appeared at Do Not Research, which is a web magazine / art collective group that I've been involved with to some extent for 3 or 4 years at this point. And yeah, this is actually derived from a talk that I gave to the Fordham Philosophers Society last fall,
Okay.
and it's kind of about it's a sort of a overview of cybernetics. Like, what is cybernetics? Why is it related to philosophy? Like, what's the future of cybernetics? What's the standing of cybernetics today? This is something I've done a lot of work on in the last decade, basically. And cybernetics is cool. I've talked about it on the pod a few times, right? I think it came up definitely during Parable of the Sower episode, and probably some other times. I just gonna bring up the article right now because I have already forgotten it. Yeah, and it basically starts with the discussion of no, I'm just kidding. It starts with a discussion of Heidegger, the famous German philosopher, 20th century, who made a little slip up in the 1930s and took a position from one Adolf Hitler to run one of the German, and he was sort of, he quit relatively quickly. He did only some terrible things, nothing murderous individually, but supporting, being one of the most important philosophers in the world and kind of giving your intellectual heft to the early days of the Nazi regime. Kind of a bad look. And he didn't give any talks in his life.
It's kind of what Charlie Kirk is doing today.
Well, Charlie Kirk is, our Heidegger. He's certainly as important a thinker. He gave this one interview later in life, in the late 60s, in 66. And it's the only interview he gave after the whole, because he was banned from teaching, he was kicked out.
After the snafu?
Yeah. After the war, he eventually was allowed to teach again, but he had a long hiatus where he was like, kept out.
Look, Martin, why don't you take a bit of time?
And eventually he gave this one interview, and he doesn't really give any satisfactory answers. What a shock about, Heidegger is one of these frustrating people where you read him and everything is just mystification upon mystification and folding in of language on itself. And, what is the being of unbeing? And you're just like, it's quite mystical. I would say he's like a worthwhile thinker. Especially The Fundamental Question of Metaphysics is a book that meant a lot to me when I was an undergrad. But he can also be extremely frustrating. And the one thing in this interview that I thought was interesting is they're like, what's the future of philosophy in the 60s? Where are we? And he was basically like, philosophy's over. It's been overtaken by the sciences, and thus the future of philosophy is cybernetics. And then he elaborates on this, not at all. And my essay is basically like, well, what would he have understood cybernetics to be in the 60s, and like where are we today? So I just look at a couple of the important thinkers, Norbert Wiener, and Gregory Bateson being the major focuses of my essay. And just talking about cybernetics is basically cybernetics. When you hear the word cyber, you tend to think of like the beloved Cybertruck, the 1990s practice of cyber sex.
Yeah.
And
age, sex, location.
Yeah. It's kind of been debased by the rise of its use as a kind of nomenclature for the internet. Mm-hmm. But cybernetics is actually quite a broad attempt at a universal science. It was an attempt at developing a set of linguistic terms that could help the different branches of sciences, both social and hard sciences, to communicate with each other, and thereby forestall the sort of hyper specialization that was kind of pushing all sciences to away from each other, right? In a kind of entropic process. And that's what I get into in the essay, and it's on Do Not Research. I won't spoil the essay by going further than that, but I will include a link to it in the show notes. Yeah. And just a reminder, you can always find links to any articles or things that we discuss in the notes to the episode. But I'm really happy. People seem to be responding well to the essay. Haven't gotten any death threats, which is be kind of weird if people were like cybernetics, Right. But basically, like my just one final thought. My point is that while we tend to think of cybernetics as being like the Terminator or like a guy with a robot arm or something,
that's where my mind went immediately.
Yeah, well, and rightly so. That's kind of how it's been sucked into popular culture.
Okay.
It's actually that's a part of it, but it's a broader, more general theory of like thinking about the way that the world works, which is essentially thinking about the concept of feedback and how feedback and you put something out in the world, you receive a response, and that changes the way you're going to behave in the future. That kind of structure is one of the only anti-entropic mechanisms that's available to humans and to other animals, and ultimately to the more complex thinking machines that we've been developing. And this is something that unites all three categories on a spectrum as being sort of resistors of entropy, because the ultimate tendency of all things is to wear down and to tend towards dissolution, chaos, and
hence the podcast.
exactly. I mean, yeah, I mean that's a good point, right? The end of the world is the ultimate triumph of entropy, right? And the ways that we resist that, in some senses, could be understood as cybernetic interventions. But moving on from that, let's move to another C word, and that C word is Caesar. So we left off last time. Sulla was triumphant, right? And then he died. And one of the guys that helped Sulla in his final triumph was Pompey. As we talked about at the very end of the episode, one of the people that was almost maybe killed in the proscription murders of all the enemies of Sulla was Julius Caesar. He was only 18 at the time, but just skated through. I read a little bit more about that, and you were sort of right to be like, maybe he wasn't even on the list. Like, there's some scholars that say that this whole thing may just be like myth building.
Part of the myth.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys like to big up their near-death experiences on their way to
the legend,
achieving mythological status.
That's right. And like Caesar was from a very famous family, the Julian clan. They had existed since at least the founding of the Republic. There's records of them going all the way back. They claim to be ascended from Iulus, who is allegedly the son of Aeneas and his Trojan wife Creusa. There's no way that is possibly true, but it means that they're descended. A lot of the patrician families like to claim they were descended from a god, and because Aeneas was Venus's son, they could be like, we're descended from a goddess, from Venus.
35th of his name, that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like the genealogy stretches back to forever, right? So Caesar was born in 100 BCE. Auspicious year to be born, I guess. His family had kind of fallen on hard times. His dad had not quite, he'd been an okay politician, but he never rose to be consul or any of the major offices. And once like Cinna took over that dictatorship we talked about, his dad was like, I'm out. And he retired, and then very soon thereafter mysteriously died. Was he murdered? Perhaps. Was he sick? Could be. We don't know. Caesar, however, much more ambitious than his father, sort of set on reclaiming the greatness of his name, and he set up on the cursus honorum, which is the sort of path that young Roman aristocrats would take in order to eventually rise into the Senate and serve in the highest.
There was like a training program?
Not a training program, but there were steps you should take.
Okay.
So you try to be the quaestor at this point, then you want to be a praetor at this. There were like offices you could shoot for, and you basically start out by being.
God damn, I'm 22. I haven't even made quaestor, like that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think it's a little older than that, but yeah, basically. And Caesar was quite successful in this. He served in the East, and eventually moved onto Spain. There's some story about him. He led a charge on the Isle of Lesbos against a rebellion, and this allegedly, according to Plutarch, whetted his appetite for honors. So he had this early success, and he was like, man, people love me.
Feels good.
This is great. There's a famous story, though, where he's a little bit older, probably in his 30s. He's still rising up the path, right? This would be around 70. And he sees a statue of Alexander the Great in Spain. And he cries, and his friends are like, Caesar, why are you crying? And he's like, when Alexander was my age, he'd already conquered the world. I'm nothing. I'm a failure. Which, did this really happen? Like, probably not. But it's a great story nonetheless, because it just speaks to how overwhelmingly ambitious this guy was. A couple more anecdotes.
He's chasing a ghost, right? Like LeBron and Jordan.
Yeah, if Jordan had lived 300 years before LeBron, or 200 years, yeah. So this is a little bit earlier when he's in the East still, around 75 BC when he was 25. He was like going to study rhetoric. Caesar was also a highly intelligent man, obviously, like great military commander, but also a great writer. His texts are still read around the world in introductory Latin classes. He wrote poems. He went to Rhodes, the Isle of Rhodes off the southern coast of modern Turkey, to study rhetoric. And I've been there. It's a really beautiful island. I really would like to go back someday. And he was kidnapped. Like pirates. This region was famous for pirates. Pirates like swung around the cove. They got Caesar's ship. And they weren't like murderous pirates. Their deal was they would capture you and then ransom you.
So they're like, someone's just like, look, the rhetoric program is fantastic, but there are pirates. Yeah. The rhetoric program is top notch. I mean, I'm not saying don't go and study rhetoric. Of course, go to Rhodes, but just be careful.
Yeah, well, this is funny, right? So Caesar is fine. He's like palling around with the pirates. He gets kidnapped. He gets kidnapped. They know he's a rich Roman. Like they can tell from the toga he's wearing or whatever. Like, oh, it's one of those Versace togas that Caesar has there.
We told you, if you're going to study rhetoric, dress down.
So he's held by these guys for 38 days, during which time he's like bossing them around. He's forcing them to listen to his speeches and poems. And if they don't because
he's not concerned about any violence coming to his body because he's valuable. Right?
Yeah, he knows that if he's dead, they get nothing. So
I see you. Is that what he's saying? Stuff like that? I see you.
Yeah, and he's also just like, they're like, we're going to ransom you for 20 talents. 20 talents is like a huge amount of silver. Like, it's just piles and piles of stuff. And he's like, well, 20? No. I'm worth at least 50. Like, you gotta up your game here a little bit.
Put some talents on my name.
Yeah. After 30, and while he was joking around with them, he's like, one day I'm going to have all of you guys crucified. And they're like, oh, good one, Caesar. Like, ha, ha, ha. So after 38 days, the ransom comes through. Caesar goes back to Miletus, which is one of the big, Roman-controlled cities in the area. Immediately raises a fleet, which is odd because he's not even like a general at this point. He's just like, I got kidnapped. I need to get that money back. So he gets a fleet, goes right back to the island where he was held. The pirates are just like lazing around, like smoking lotus blossoms or whatever people did.
Just like lying on their talents.
Yeah, exactly. They're right. They're like playing with the gold.
Swimming in silver. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, as he had promised, captured the pirates and had them all crucified. And like the governor was like, I don't know, should we really crucify these guys? Caesar was like, yes. Caesar. Right. And like, again, this is from Plutarch, 150 years later. Is it factual? Doesn't matter. It's a great story. And it just goes to...
I like 38 days. I like the idea that the ransom came through in 38 days. Like that's
a long time.
I'd say, are you kidding me? I'm saying back then, like, dude, if you take all of human history that has occurred over this time period, like, it's pretty close to Venmo, right? If you think of
it. Well, it didn't have to go to Rome, right? They just had to go to...
No, I know, but still, like, that's 5 weeks and change.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, you're right. I like that.
It's not same day. It's not Western Union, but like...
to borrow the phrase of Herzog, Werner Herzog, even if these anecdotes aren't exactly true, they express the ecstatic truth of Caesar, which is that he's
which is much of the joy in studying and learning about Caesar.
Yeah, it's like, even if this isn't true, who cares? It's a great story. Print the legend, etc. So early on in his career, Caesar's a supporter of Pompey. Pompey was the guy who, after Sulla died, kind of rose to prominence as the dominant politician and general of Rome. Not right away. There's some bumps along the road, but by the 70s, Pompey's sitting on top, and he's an interesting guy. His dad was the first member of the family to be a senator. So they were what is known as novus homo. He was a novus homo, like a new
Right.
man. He hadn't been a senator before, but his family had been uplifted. And he had been the consul in 89. When Marius returned, his father mysteriously died. um, was he murdered by his troops? There's some talk that Pompey's father was like the worst guy ever. That just everyone hated this guy. But, you know,
Right.
he's one of those people who like rises to the top and you're like, how did this happen? Like, what's going on? And then
I haven't seen that again.
that's never happened since, actually. This is the only time. But basically, he gets murdered, and Pompey leaves Rome during Cinna's sort of semi-tyranny in the 80s. He kind of slowly gathers an army in Spain among his father's clients, and when Sulla returns, Pompey like goes to Sulla and he has his army. He's like, "Hey, well, like what? Where to, boss?"
Yeah.
And he's quite young. He's quite young at this point. I think he's still in his 20s, and he ends up working for Sulla. Wins a couple.
Imagine just having an army at your beck and call in your 20s. My God.
Yeah, pretty crazy. And
In
Pompey,
retrospect, these guys probably showed actually a lot of restraint.
well, so Pompey helps Sulla. Even after Sulla's dead, there's still pockets of Marian resistance. These populares. The populares optimates thing kind of breaks down a little bit during this time because, you know, Pompey is allegedly a optimates at this point, but he's also
Right.
like very quickly like accumulating a lot of personal power through the influence of his like plebeian supporters. So it's like
Quickly, for if people hadn't listened to the last one, just define quickly the
right. So the
two.
populares are the people whose support derives from the plebeian, which is to say the non-aristocratic people of the Roman Empire, and the optimates are the people who think all power should remain with the Senate and with those who are to the manor born, so to speak.
Mhm.
And Pompey and Crassus, who we'll get to in a minute, both kind of skirt this line. They kind of they have alliances with Sulla, who's the sort of optimates figure, but ultimately they make an alliance with Caesar, who's the populares figure. So this kind of distinction that's very useful in the era we covered with in the Mike Duncan book last time
Yeah.
is a little bit less. It's a little bit more complicated here until we get to the end of the story, which will be in 5 hours. No. Just going on further, the other big thing that happens is 71, so Pompey would be about 35. He's off in Spain and North Africa, you know, wrapping up some rebellions or whatever. And Rome has been dealing with this annoying guy, Spartacus.
Pesky Spartacus.
Right. This is obviously one of the most famous events in Roman history. And Crassus, our last character, who we'll come to in a little bit, is the one who's like dealing with it, basically. And he's dealing with it well. Spartacus is on the run. Spartacus and his other compatriots made some tactical errors. They had a chance to flee out of Italy.
They were hot early.
Oh yeah, they just kept defeating legions. Like a legion would come, and Spartacus and his gladiator buddies.
Heat check after heat check.
Yeah, and then they sort of pressed their luck a little bit. You know, it's like one of those NCAA tournament, like 15 seed is up.
Right.
They're up 20 in the
They're
first
up
half.
at half somehow.
Yeah, they're big at half.
Energy in the arena.
And then by the end of the game, it's like, oh, number 2 seed has triumphed.
That size inside really starts to wear them down.
yeah. Everyone's got 4 fouls, right? Exactly. So Crassus is mopping these guys up, and then Pompey swoops in at the last minute and like finishes off Spartacus, and is like, I have triumphed over Spartacus. And Crassus is just like, what the F are you?
Yeah.
You know, like, how dare you? This starts a long-term animosity between them. Between Crassus, who's this very rich guy who we'll talk about in a little bit. I just want to wrap up a couple more of Pompey's accomplishments. But this is one of the tensions that will ultimately be resolved by Caesar. So, and also, Pompey kind of has this reputation for doing this, kind of being a bit of a vulture, swooping in at the last second as someone's about to defeat, and then claiming credit for the whole victory himself, which is something that you'll remember Sulla accused Marius of doing in the last episode. So a little bit later on in the 60s, Pompey Mithridates, our old friend from the east, from Pontus, which I simply must visit, is a thorn again. This is 30 straight years this guy has just been causing problems with Rome, but he's finally on the run. This great general Lucullus is, destroying his armies. Mithridates has fled up into like Ukraine. Like he's had to go across the Black Sea. And at the last second, Pompey once again, with Senate approval, is like, I think Lucullus he needs a rest.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take over. And the same thing happens. He takes over. He follows Mithridates up into Crimea, and finally Mithridates kills himself. There's the great story of Mithridates trying to kill himself. He's like taking every poison, but he's like, oh right, I'm immune to all these poisons. So I think he eventually has to have his servants, like his slaves, like stab him or what have you. After this, though, like Mithridates, even till the end, was a hard out, right? He was, and he like destroyed. Pompey went further east, destroyed the last of the Seleucid Empire, which was this vestige of Alexander the Great's empire, Greek Empire in Syria. And he claimed Syria for Rome. He's like, Syria, this is a new province for Rome. Big move. He also went down and conquered Judea and was the first Roman to enter Jerusalem, where he sacked Jerusalem and pillaged the temple. And that would be the last anyone would ever hear of the... Oh, no, wait. There would be further problems with them a little bit later. But this is big. This is like the height of Pompey's power.
Now he's Pompey the Great?
This is when he's Pompey the Great. He's conquered the East. The East is Roman. The enemies are pacified.
I'm going to go with the Great.
Right. I mean, do you think there was a meeting where he's like, Pompey, we're going to award you a name. What would you like? Magnus the Great.
Yeah.
He's a humble guy, Pompey. So they get back. Pompey wants to reward all of his loyal soldiers with some land and some pay rises, and the Senate is like, not so fast, Pompey. Mm-hmm. And this is what leads to the triumvirate, which is this tripartite alliance between Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus. Crassus, the last person, he's the oldest member of this group. He's the richest guy in Rome.
He's the money guy, right? Yeah.
He's so rich. And the funny thing is, he is self-made. I mean, his dad was okay, but he's not someone who inherited. He's not a who's an example of this? Donald Trump figure, shall we say? Someone who inherited a little bit of money and turned it into a lot. And how did he do that? Well, real estate speculation, essentially.
Oh, like good. The tale as old as time.
Yeah, it's a little. There is some similarities to Trump now that I think about it. Crassus founded the first fire brigade in Rome. Whereby he had 200 men with buckets filled with water, and there were fires in Rome basically every day because everything's made out of wood, right?
Keep your bucket full. You never know.
But the thing that they would do that's so funny is they'd run up, you'd see these slaves running up and be like, oh, the fire brigade's coming, hooray. And then Crassus would appear and he'd be like, wow, what a shame, your building's on fire. I will buy that for 1/10 of 1 talent of silver. And the owner would be like, what are you talking about? This building's worth 4 talents. Blah, blah, blah. He's freaking out. And until the guy agreed to sell at the ruinous price demanded by Crassus, they would just watch. And as soon as he sold, the guys would get to work. They'd put the buckets on. And then the other thing is, if he just let the place burn down, Crassus would then offer an even lower price for the lot. And then
choice is yours, man. Yeah. Choice is yours. Yeah. I mean, the water's right here. The guys are right here.
Yep. Look, all these units, beautiful
units. The good
units.
thing is, it's still your decision at the end of the
day. Exactly. And he did stuff like this. He also, owned mines, did trade in slaves, but he built his wealth up to be according to Plutarch, one of the richest people in the ancient world.
Okay.
He's also, as we said, hates Pompey because he feels like Pompey keeps getting these successes that aren't really, Crassus is a military commander, but he hasn't had the great success of Pompey.
And Pompey's just getting triumph after triumph, right?
Basically. And when Caesar starts to get triumphs, Crassus is like, this is all This is all getting to be a little much, right?
That's right.
So his big ambition ultimately is to go to the east, right? So they form this secret group, the Triumvirate. Caesar becomes consul in 59, or is it 58? And Crassus has been bankrolling Caesar's career for a long time at this point, right? The amount of bribery that went on in Roman elections was insane.
Yeah.
I mean, like, Crassus would be like going around lining people's pockets, being like, "Remember, if you don't vote Caesar, you won't get any more of this good gold or whatever." I mean, it's just like, I'm sure.
Did you hear what happened to your buddy's house the other day?
Exactly, right. And I mean, this isn't. Luckily, we've moved beyond this, and money plays no role in our politics today. But Crassus has this driving ambition that he wants to be a Caesar. He wants to be a Pompey. So after Caesar is consul, he arranges to take over the proconsulship, which is essentially the governorship of these provinces. He gets Illyricum, which is on the other side of the Adriatic, and he gets Cisalpine Gaul, which is the part of Gaul that's on this side of the Alps, kind of northern Italy, really, now. And then the governor of Transalpine Gaul, which is the part of Gaul that's between Spain and Italy, basically, on the coast, sort of French Riviera. The governor dies, so Caesar gets that too. This is what Caesar uses as the foundation to conquer all of modern France, right? And Belgium. He spends the next 7 or 8 years ruthlessly and brutally conquering France. And that's a great story unto itself. We're going to have to skip over it because of time. But
all we have to tell you is it worked.
He won. He defeated Vercingetorix, the great, beautiful, mustached, Gallic prince.
Gorgeous Vercingetorix.
Yeah, R.I.P. Gone too soon. And he went to England. He was the first Roman to lead an army into England, fought some skirmishes, decided, we'll come back for this later. 100 years later, of course, the Romans would conquer England as well. And Crassus is seeing all of this, and he's just like, God damn it. Another one.
They've never gone to Syria.
Yeah, so basically he decides he's going to go to Syria. Crassus, this is 55 BCE. They meet again to renew their alliance. Pompey has married Caesar's daughter, Julia. Apparently it's a very happy marriage.
So Crassus can see like these two are building up a power that far out exceeds his, right?
That's right. And so Crassus wants to get on the action. So he decides to conquer Parthia. Parthia is the iteration of the Persian Empire that exists at this time, and it has a border with the new Roman province of Syria on the Euphrates River, essentially. It's the Parthians' territory begins in what is today basically modern Iraq. So Crassus goes east with a huge army of 40,000 or so men, mix of infantry and cavalry, and is going to conquer the Persian Empire. And I mean, hey, Alexander did it with less than that. So
how hard can it be?
It's not that. He's got a lot of bad intelligence, though. People have told him, Crassus will be easy. The empire is a mess. There's a lot of internal struggle right now. The army's not very good. The archers, don't worry about them. You're fine. One of the people who had been Pompey's agent earlier on in his conquest in the east is the one who's giving Crassus all this bad info. The king of Armenia, who's a Roman ally, is like, Crassus, come up to Armenia. I'll give you 30,000 more men that you can take. Crassus says, no, it's too slow. We're going the direct route. We're just going right through the desert. This ends up being a terrible idea because in 54, Crassus has some success, defeats, a few skirmishing parties. 53 decides to go all the way. He's going to march right into the heart of Mesopotamia and conquer it all for Rome. He goes to this place called Carrhae, at which point his army is beset by a much smaller force, but it's the Parthians. The Parthians are horse archers. And if there's one thing you don't want to run into in world history, it's horse archers. these guys, because what they can do is the Parthians they have this so-called Parthian shot, where as they're riding away from you, they turn around and keep shooting. So even as they're retreating, and Crassus gets his huge army into the testudo formation, which is like where you put your shield up. It's the turtle formation.
Yeah.
And he is like, don't worry, guys. We'll just wait until they're out of arrows, and then we'll kill them easily. What he doesn't realize is that there's a camel train of just like an Uber of arrows arriving. So in other words, they're never going to run out of arrows.
Right.
And indeed, they don't. And indeed, they end up slaughtering this entire army, which is eventually Crassus' son.
Because their arms got tired, and they were like, I can't keep this shield up here any longer?
Basically. I mean, they're there for hours and hours, and even overnight. Like, it goes really long. And then they decide to flee back to this fort. Crassus' son is killed. Crassus he's done for. He's depressed. He goes out to have a meeting with the Parthian general to arrange some kind of surrender. A skirmish breaks out. Crassus is killed and beheaded. And legends say that either his head was molten gold was poured into his head because he's so rich, right? I don't know if that really happened. That's a classic thing they say. It's sort of like Game of Thrones thing, right?
Yeah.
And another thing that's said is they took his head and used it in a play in the Bacchae, where Pentheus has his head cut off by his mother, and then in this version of the play, they just used Crassus's actual head as a prop.
Wait a minute, is that they're like sitting in the audience? Is that Crassus's head?
Yeah. Well, that's a funny thing, right? Like, how are these Parthians who are doing this play supposed to know what Crassus looks like?
Yeah, right.
Regardless, this is the worst Roman defeat between the Battle of Cannae in the Second Punic War and the famous loss of the legions in the Teutoburg Forest. So now the triumvirate's down to two guys, and this is when things really start heating up. Caesar's conquered Gaul. The senators are pissed. They don't like this Caesar. He's gotten too powerful. And in a weird move, Pompey kind of allies with them. He sort of sets himself up as the head of the senatorial optimates faction against this, this upstart Caesar. The other people that are on his side are people like Cicero, the famous rhetorician and philosopher.
Pompey's side.
On Pompey's side, who'd earlier stopped an alleged tyrannical conspiracy by this guy Catiline, and Cato the Younger. Cato the Younger is the descendant of the guy who during the Third Punic War was like, every speech he gave said, and furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed. So the other person that they're allied with is the last major player in our story, and that's Marcus Junius Brutus, right? Brutus of the Et Brute that falls Caesar, right? He had been Caesar's friend earlier in life. Caesar had been having a long time affair with his mother, Servilia. There are even rumors in the ancient world that Brutus was secretly Caesar's son. This is not true, as best we can tell. The dates don't really work out since Caesar's only, I think, 14 years older than Brutus. Be a little early to I don't
know. You're ambitious.
Yeah, but I mean, anyway. And Brutus is descended from Lucius Junius Brutus, the original Brutus, who was the guy who expelled Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome. So it's almost, for Brutus, there's almost this like anti-monarchical heritage is like built into his whole understanding of his life. And basically, they all side with Pompey. At this point, Caesar makes the fateful decision to cross the Rubicon.
Yes.
Which is, it's the funny thing about that is that, like, we don't even know where the Rubicon was. Like, apparently the Rubicon's just some tiny stream. So that was coming up a lot. Like, we've crossed the Rubicon. I felt like in political rhetoric recently.
Yes. Well, yeah, it's only lasted for
2,000
years.
Yeah, almost 2,100 years. Wow. And
but in the previous episode, like, armies had gone into Rome, right?
Yep. This isn't the first time this has happened.
Right. Okay.
The thing that's different, I guess, is that...
But it's sort of portrayed like that in people's heads, I think. That, like, this was...
I mean, Sulla did it twice.
Right,
like,
exactly. That's what I mean. But this one still, I think, in the popular memory is like, you never went through the gates of Rome with an army.
Yeah, well, I think this is different because rather than fight, they all just run. All the optimates just get on ships and go to Greece. Pompey is like, don't worry, I have.
Don't worry, let's just cede all the territory, and then it'll work out for sure.
Well, his thought is, I have my veterans. Remember, he'd conquered the East. He'd settled his veterans in Syria, Greece, the places he claimed for Mithridates.
I'll go get my guys.
And we'll be good. We'll have an army. We'll meet Caesar on a battlefield of our choosing. Also, we'll make Caesar come to us.
That's right.
Rather than be besieged. Almost immediately, Pompey is accused of cowardice. I think there's a little bit of...
Why would that be? Because he ran away? Almost immediately.
And I think, Caesar is the better general, clearly, as will be borne out very shortly, and is also the man on the rise. And remember, Caesar has these armies, I think it's 7 or 8 legions, it's a large army, that have been with him for almost a decade at this point. And Pompey is going back to get his veterans, but those veterans, what have they been? They've been
chilling on the farm.
I've been learning to weave.
I got kids now, man. I got fucking kids. I got
Pompey,
kids.
Really?
Yeah.
You ask this of me?
I thought you liked this guy the whole time. I thought you liked this guy.
Yeah. The real spur of this is that if Caesar gives up his governorship, the Senate are going to arrest him and basically banish him or kill him. Caesar can't have that happen. So they have a war. Caesar sails across the Adriatic. On August 9th, 48 BCE, the two sides meet, and Pompey, once again, refuses to charge. Pompey has a much bigger army. He has more men, but Caesar has better men, right? As we just discussed. Caesar's men charge, and Pompey's like, oh, good, they're going to be tired out by the time they get here. Then they, just out of range of spear throwers, stop, rest up, and then renew their charge.
Oh my God. And Pompey's like, I didn't even know they could do that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, right? And Caesar also has a secret. He has his cavalry out on his right wing. There's a secret fourth line behind them. The cavalry come out. Pompey's cavalry sort of are defeating Caesar's cavalry. Cavalry pull back, and the fourth line emerges, and they just cut Pompey's cavalry down.
What is that? What is that? Is that a hidden fourth line? No!
Yeah, I mean, basically. And pretty soon, Pompey runs. His army is broken. They're slaughtered.
Shortly after that, people accused him of cowardice.
Well, that's the thing. He goes further east, and he's like, we've got to regroup.
Yeah, I'll get my guys. I got other guys.
Yeah. The writing's kind of on the wall for Pompey at this point. Cato and a couple of other people go off to Africa to gather more forces. And Pompey's like, well, I'm going to go to Egypt. I've long been friends with the Ptolemies. They'll help me. And he gets to Egypt and is beheaded on the beach, right? In the show Rome, this is, I think, very memorably depicted.
Which Caesar did not want to have happen.
No, I mean, Caesar probably understood Pompey would have to die, but he did not want him to be betrayed and murdered by a quote-unquote barbarian king, right? A non-Roman. If he was going to be killed, it should be done through the Roman system. At this point, Caesar spends the next 3 years or so mopping up. He gets embroiled in Egypt, has this affair with Cleopatra, has this child by her, right?
Embroiled, huh?
Yeah. He's besieged in her palace for a while. She meets him by hiding in a blanket, all this cool stuff. That is dealt with. Cleopatra is established as the Queen of Egypt, and it is a client kingdom of Rome at this point fully. He defeats Cato and their forces in near Carthage. Cato, rather than be granted clemency by Caesar, because this is the other thing. Caesar's big thing is clemency. He's like, I've defeated you, but all is forgiven. So after Pharsalus, the battle against Pompey, Brutus comes to Caesar and is like, I was wrong, Caesar. Caesar is like, clemency. Cassius, another guy, comes, clemency. This is probably Caesar's big mistake, right? He's too nice. There's one final battle
in this particular regard.
Yeah, I mean, he's not this nice to Vercingetorix.
Nice. It's a strategy, right? It's a tactic.
Yeah, I mean, he wants to differentiate himself from Sulla and Marius, who would just mass murder all their enemies, right? He's trying to be like, no, a new age has dawned. So by 45 BC, there's a final battle at Munda, which Caesar almost loses. Can you imagine if he lost that? He got all that way.
Might still be alive today.
Who, Caesar?
Yeah.
I mean, it would be wild if he defeated Pompey, defeated, all these people, and then just like Labienus defeats him in Munda.
Right.
Like, what happens to world history after that?
This is an interesting question. Maybe for next week.
No. Quite enough. One thing that's interesting is Caesar gets home to Rome in October 45. He's acclaimed dictator for 5 years and then eventually dictator for life. Mm-hmm. And then there's just one quote I found on Wikipedia from this guy, Ernst Badian, says that although Caesar did implement a series of reforms, the most famous being the reform of the calendar, the Julian calendar, which is why we have July and then August. I'm
going to go with July.
Yeah. Where did that come from? It's unclear.
That is like the most baller thing in world history, though. I think it's just that you are in the calendar still.
And then Augustus also, right?
Yeah, of course.
Augustus can't be outdone.
And they took the best months.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's wise. Well, not if you're in the southern hemisphere, which they did not know about. Anyway, he says he initiated a series of reforms. They did not touch the core of the republican system, and he had no plans for basic social and constitutional reform. And, he got a lot of extraordinary honors, but he was kind of merely grafted him as an ill-fitting head onto the body of a traditional structure, which I think is important to note. Like, doesn't seem like Caesar was like a revolutionary. He wasn't like, all right, we're going to redo everything. There are not going to be any senates anymore. They're going to be this, it's not like the
first time. You know how long it's going to take me to just get the calendar done?
So, almost immediately upon Caesar's returning to Rome, and even a little bit before, there's a conspiracy to kill him, right? Among largely the people that he's already forgiven and granted clemency. Even though
he did make himself dictator for life.
Well, he had himself made dictator for life. And he also made it clear.
No wholesale changes to the system of government, but there is this one thing.
Well, Mark Antony approached him allegedly with a crown, right?
Yeah,
Caesar, be our king. And Caesar says, no. It's obviously like stage managed, right? I'm like, I'm not.
Mark, come at me with the crown. Okay, do your whole thing. And then I'm gonna turn it down. Anthony's just like, what a fucking genius this guy is.
Well, Anthony's also an idiot, though, because the conspirators approached him in the summer of 45 and were like, Mark Antony, we're going to kill Caesar. You want in? He's like, nah. Does he tell Caesar? No.
Right.
Hey, Caesar, Brutus came up to me, by the way, and was like, we're going to kill you.
No way. Not Brutus.
No, he's my best guy, Brutus. No way. They're unsatisfied. And one of the reasons is Caesar's made it clear he's going to control the consular elections here on out. And a lot of these people are people that would have been consuls if the old system. So they're like, okay, I'm never going to get to wear the special toga or whatever. I'm never going to be.
What's it even for anymore?
Well, I mean, basically, right? Yeah. And, some of them were longtime allies of Pompey. Some of them were pure optimates, people who'd went back to Sulla. A lot of them
because Caesar was popular at this time.
Very popular. Although there seems to have been some popular unrest based on graffiti that's been found.
Right, but generally speaking, they were dealing with someone who was not simply holding on to power in this brutal authoritarian way, which he did in at times and in various elements. But there was a core group of the Roman citizenry that adored Hitler, that adored Caesar right until the end.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. He was incredibly popular. And he's just had all these triumphs. He's given all these donatives to his troops, to the people of Rome. Nevertheless,
he's adopted Augustus.
Well, that happens after he's dead. That's in his will. So Caesar's going to go east because he's got to get revenge for Crassus, for his good buddy Crassus.
He can't stop fighting. He can't stop conquering.
He can't stop conquering. He's going to conquer Dacia also, which is modern Romania.
Stick around and rule for a while, man.
Well,
Augustus learned, right?
Yeah, I mean, Augustus also did more conquering than anyone else, though, but he didn't do it himself. That's the difference.
That's right.
Yeah. So he's going to leave on March 18th. The last meeting of the Senate is March 15th, the Ides of March. Caesar allegedly received oracles. Don't go to the meeting, Caesar. People came up, warned him. Caesar didn't care. Caesar also didn't have any armed bodyguards. He had a couple guys that would go around with him. Mark Antony was not with him on the day of his assassination, though. Where was Mark Antony?
Mm-hmm.
No one is sure.
Trying to figure out what side he was on, I guess.
I mean, basically.
Still considering what to do.
I mean, Mark Antony's kind of an idiot, right? I mean, he has some good qualities, but I'm trying to figure out
he's a fun historical character.
Yeah. He's not a great leader. So Caesar goes in. He's sitting on his big throne that he now has.
Mm-hmm.
And
he's not the king, but it's one hell of a chair.
Yeah. So this is the part that I've written about a little bit in my book. My first book, Communicating Groups, which came out in 2020, right as COVID was hitting. So I thought I'd just read some passages from that.
Yeah, please.
So the death of Julius Caesar is one of the events of all time. There are many questions left unanswered. Why did Caesar ignore all warnings? Caesar's assassination is a special case. It presents a challenge, but I'm sure we can use forensic science to determine why and how he was killed. This is also at its heart an act of comparative literary criticism, the weighing of all the relevant ancient sources. Using computer-generated models, we will recreate the crime scene, which today is covered over by a curved alleyway and a rounded building whose walls bend where the theater of Pompey once stood. How could such a man, who was always prepared, be so unprepared? Or was it a kind of suicide by senator? What did Caesar really think about himself? Did the conspirators actually mastermind his murder? Or were they then, as before, merely Caesar's pawns in an elaborate game whose design still remains veiled by the distorting lenses of historians and artists? It will be unclear. So that's one section. And then I want to just read this other one about the physical logistics of how the assassination worked, right?
Sure.
His home, Caesar's, has only recently been identified. It now stands a complex ruin. The autopsy reports he was stabbed 23 times, though only one of the wounds was deemed by the doctors to have been fatal. Does this imply there were 23 conspirators? Or is it possible there were many more who in the mad rush failed to get in a cut? A crowd of 23 people is radically impractical for this kind of thing. Even 11 men, if human nature holds across the generations, are far too many for this number of wounds. It seems likely there are possibly as few as 5 conspirators who did the actual stabbing, while the others watched out for witnesses, ran crowd control, interfered with Caesar's bodyguards. All the reports indicate it was an incredibly chaotic scene, a frenzy more animal and brutal than anything seen on the contemporary stage. So another thing we haven't talked about.
I like the idea that they're senators, so they just really suck at stabbing.
Yeah, it's just like there's like 100 of them all. Well,
just a bunch of like old crotchety men who totally can't wield a knife effectively. So it's like
yeah, and I mean, part of what inspired me about that was a documentary I watched that was like obviously trying to recreate the assassination through a computer generated model, and I just thought that was hilarious. Another thing is like Caesar had
is the idea that like he set this up to die so that his family dynasty would be born?
No, it's more that Caesar had epilepsy. That's one thing we haven't talked about. They called it his falling sickness.
Sure.
And it's possible that, like, I'll read one more section because it gets into this.
Yeah, please.
Caesar's temporal lobe epilepsy was gradually getting worse. It seems likely the epilepsy induced in him a state of constant agitation, a low-grade mania that can be used to retroactively account for his prolific activity as a writer, sexual being, and conqueror. Brutus stabbed him in the groin. The conspirators took to the streets, proclaiming their victory over tyranny. Caesar must have known about the conspiracy to kill him. he deliberately provoked his enemies by means of public insults. Was his death the suicide of a sick and dying man, or was there more to it? Was this suicide entirely thus rational, despite its being exacerbated by the irrational inducements of his illness? Was his death motivated by a desire for the eternal fame he surely achieved? What is fame to a dead man? Within 3 years, all of the murderers, all of the conspirators, were dead. His selected heir, Octavian, was judiciously chosen, to say the least. In this way, even through his own death, Caesar can be said to have won. And had Antony defeated Octavian at Actium, the same could still be said, for Antony was also Caesar's blood. His genes survived, maintaining a stranglehold on power in Rome for a century, until at last, it seems, the madness finally won out. Though we cannot say that is what really happened with any certainty. Yeah, so what I'm interested in here is just just the idea that, like, maybe Caesar knew this was coming and kind of let it come.
Right.
Sort of understanding. I mean, I don't literally think this is true, but I think it's just kind of fun to toy with this as a, potential reading of the situation.
Also, just like, I mean, we're at the end, we're wrapping up here, but it is like, there's the meme, how often do you think of the Roman Empire?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, how often do you think about it? I think about it all the time. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think about it every day.
It's always on my mind. I mean, it is.
I mean, I was a Latin scholar for.
Like, I don't care either. I don't apologize. I mean, it is.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. We don't have to get into all of that.
I mean, we've both been to Italy like dozens of times or whatever.
Again, like both, the power of sort of the tale of this one moment.
Yeah.
Given a day, right? Like, we know when, we know how, just, the obsession with it, and the idea, whether like rationally accurate from a historical perspective or from a mythological perspective or a cultural perspective, like this being on just a day, becoming a touchstone from which, we will consider it for thousands and thousands of years, is like, speaking to what you're saying, like, is it just an incredible legacy? Never mind the genetics being passed on. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, his phrases are still used. I mean, there's just something about this particular moment that, because of the nature of power and the sort of discourse between popular rule, populism, governmental structures, and authoritarianism and dictatorships, but like, it sort of encapsulated something that we have seen play out over and over again,
and are still seeing play out.
Still are seeing it right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, one final thought about the assassination is, if their goal was to preserve the Republic, they could accomplish. Well, I mean, they could not have failed more completely, right? I mean, it only hastened an end that was already fast in coming. And again, I think that is often the case with assassinations in history, is that they end up accomplishing the exact opposite of what they set out to. Or anyway, but I'm glad you were talking about the problems of statecraft and how to organize our society a little bit.
Well, be it Facebook Messenger, be it DM on Instagram, be it Signal, right? These are the things that the statesman must consider.
Yeah. Well, but next week we're going to be talking about the recent book Abundance.
Yes, we are.
Which a lot of people have talked about, but it seems relevant given that we're interested in the future and whether we have one in particular, and that this is Ezra Klein and a co-writer whose name I'm forgetting at the moment have put up this proposal for what the presumably Democrats should focus on as their sort of next. It's sort of a policy manifesto, and I
cannot wait for this one. I'm going to be honest. I'm very excited about next week's podcast.
Okay, well, I'm excited too. And in the meantime, if you like the show, you can follow us on the podcatcher of your choice.
Yeah, please do.
And you can also leave us a review at wherever you, at that said podcatcher. You can also follow us on Instagram at the end of the world, WMS. We'll be back next week with abundance. But until then, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And we'll talk to you real soon.